In 1985, Los Angeles would be terrorized by a series of brutal rapes and murders.
The panic that swept the county was enormous.
People didn't know if they were going to live to see the next morning.
Men, women, the elderly and children were all in the sadistic killer's sights.
Their final hours were at the hands of someone who was laughing as he tortured and raped and killed them.
A serial murderer who broke all the rules.
The suspect has used guns, knives, tire irons.
Violent, he really was.
The attacker, christened the Night Stalker, would go down as one of history's most heinous killers.
I think he is the worst. I think he would be #1 on the monster list there.
But who was the Night Stalker?
He was friendly and he was nice.
Charming is how I would describe him.
And was he born to kill?
He just had this evil look in his eye, as if he were possessed.
The 17th of March, 1985, and Gil Carrillo, a young homicide detective with the LA County Sheriff's Department, was called to an incident in the Rosemead district.
Sunday evening, 10:40 at night, call comes in, very typical. Okay, Gil, you got one dead, one wounded, and I'm just going to work another routine, mundane murder.
Carrillo didn't yet know it, but this murder would be anything but routine.
We entered the location on Village Lane. Dale Okazaki was lying on her back in the kitchen. She had sustained a gunshot wound to the head.
34-year-old Dale Okazaki had been unloading groceries when a man entered her apartment and executed her where she stood.
I can still see her today.
Dale's flatmate, 22-year-old Maria Hernandez, had also been shot at point-blank range, but had survived. She didn't recognize her attacker, and nothing had been taken from the property.
We just had our work cut out for us. We didn't know if there was an angry boyfriend, if it was a home invasion robbery gone awry, what it was.
Detectives then learned that the killer had struck again.
It occurred about a half hour later. It was in the same general area of town, and the same gun was used.
In nearby Monterey Park, 30-year-old law student Se Lian Yu had been driving home when another driver forced her to stop, then at close range.
Almost immediately, we were aware that we had some sort of a series going, not knowing just how big it was going to get or grow.
The nature of the crimes was not typical of a serial killer.
The overwhelming majority of serial sexual murderers kill up close and personal. Manual strangulation, ligature strangulation, multiple stab wounds, blunt force trauma. Very, very rarely do they shoot somebody because it's too cold and too impersonal.
On the morning of March the 27th, the bodies of 64-year-old Vincent Zazara and his 44-year-old wife Maxine were discovered in their home in the pleasant suburb of Whittier. The same gun had been used, but behavior at the crime scene was significantly different. Vincent Zazzara had been shot as he slept. Maxine had been shot and stabbed repeatedly. And the killer had taken a gruesome souvenir.
The woman's eyes were gouged out, not to be found.
Many serial murderers take souvenirs from people that they kill, whether it's a piece of flesh, piece of jewelry, something. It is a concrete reminder. It's something they can see, something they can hold on to, something that says, wow, you did this.
On April the 15th, 2 weeks after the murder and mutilation of the Zazzaras, the killer appeared to have struck again. Linda Martinez was called to process the crime scene at the home of William and Lillian Doy, a couple in their mid-60s.
There were casings on the living room floor. Mr. Doy was still in his bed and he had been shot. Mrs. Doy's room was next to the master bedroom. She was an invalid, so she had her own room. She had been sexually assaulted. It always is distressing to go into a crime scene.
William Doy had been quickly dispatched with a gunshot to the head. 63-year-old Lillian had been restrained with thumb cuffs, beaten, terrorized, and raped. But the killer had let her live.
It was unusual for a serial murderer to have two people shooting one and acting like a serial murderer with the other one.
Men he was killing because they were the obstacle to get to his lust, the women.
It was an issue of control. It was an issue of not being overpowered. What husband or man would lay there and not intervene in trying to keep his partner from being attacked?
Despite the many inconsistencies, Detective Gil Carrillo suspected that just one man was responsible for all the crimes.
I felt very strongly there was a serial killer going on. Back at the time, there were two renowned psychologists, one from New York and one from locally here on the West Coast from UCLA, that essentially said that we were full of hot air, that one man was not capable of performing what we were alleging.
6 weeks later, in the leafy city of Monrovia, two sisters, both in their 80s, were discovered in the home they shared. One had been raped. Both had been severely beaten with a hammer. Here again, there was something new.
There was a whole aspect of the occult.
There were some pentagrams, some things written on the wall. There were some markings on the body.
The crimes appeared related, but defied the current theories regarding serial murder.
When I was first contacted about the murders, police were baffled. They had no idea who was doing this, how it was happening. They wondered what type of a person would have done this. I mean, was it a maniac? Was it a group of people? Because don't forget, in California, they had Charles Manson, who, with his cult, went out murdering an awful lot of individuals. But my impression was that it was a single individual. It was someone who was not insane, who was not showing outrageous behaviors, and that he was probably young. He was probably either Caucasian, Hispanic, but he was certainly not a standout in his community.
The press would dub the mystery killer the Night Stalker, and those who had known him would never have suspected what he was capable of.
He was an ordinary kid, no different than the rest of us.
He was friendly and he was nice, and And he was so funny. He was so funny. He would always have me laughing.
And the Night Stalker's reign of terror had only just begun. May 1985, and the Night Stalker had only just begun a series of crimes that would both sicken and terrify the residents of California. Preying on the unsuspecting citizens in their homes, he took glee in rape, murder, and mutilation. As the crimes escalated, detectives raced to try to identify who was responsible for the shockingly vicious attacks. Who was the Night Stalker? Richard Ramirez was born in 1960, the last of 5 children to Mexican immigrants, living in the Texan border town of El Paso.
El Paso was a town of about 500,000 people, and across the Rio Grande was Ciudad Juarez, which had 1.5 million people, about triple the size of El Paso. It's a heavily Hispanic population.
It was basically a very quiet town, a very quiet place to live.
Ramirez had a humble upbringing, typical to his neighborhood.
It was a low-income neighborhood, but it was nice. It had green grass in front, and the house was painted. It wasn't shabby, but it was quite small.
We were like lower-class people, and everybody used to just hang around together at night. We would all play games. All the neighborhood kids would get together up until everybody's parents started calling them in for dinner.
Richard's father was hard-working and strict with his children.
He was very much what I would classify as someone from Mexico who had come to El Paso and had scratched out a living here. He worked for the railroad. It's a hard scrabble when you're a first-generation immigrant to learn a new language and try to scrape a toehold in a new country.
The young Richard Ramirez appeared no different from his friends and neighbors.
They were all very nice. Normal neighborhood family, just like mine.
He was an ordinary kid, just like the rest of us. We went to school, minded our manners, did what we had to do, but no different than the rest of us.
He was friendly and he was nice and he was so funny. He was so funny. He would always have me laughing. We used to play this game called Kick the Can, and he was the fastest runner, so we always wanted to be on his team.
Richard's friend Patricia found him kind and caring.
If we wanted to take a shortcut to school, we had to cut through this really tough neighborhood. And he always used to wait for me, sitting on a little pony wall, and then he would walk me to school. It was always safer, to be in twos, I guess.
But by the time he turned 10, it appeared all was not well with Richard Ramirez.
He used to sit in back of me in 5th grade. And I remember that he would poke me in the back. And every time he would poke me, I would jump up. And so that time that he kept poking me, I turned around very upset and I said, hey, stop. And I remember him like slumping over and then just hitting the floor on the side.
He would have seizures. He would be shaking. We knew he was sick.
Ramirez was diagnosed with epilepsy, a condition that would affect him for much of his school life. As Ramirez approached his teens, he grew distant to his father and began to look up to his cousin Mike, a Vietnam veteran who boasted of many atrocities while in service.
The cousin kept multiple mementos of his time in Vietnam. And he pulled out this box and showed all of these photographs of the women he was raping or the heads he was cutting off. It was a fascination. It wasn't recoiling in horror. It was like, wow, look what you've done.
At the age when his sexuality was being formed, Ramirez was exposed to images of rape, torture, and murder.
These individuals are in their fantasy lives from early adolescence, and in some regards, some respects, their fantasy life is more real to them than reality. Their fantasy lives are filled with sadistic aggression, where there's a fusion of sex and aggression.
Ramirez later claimed that his cousin Mike gave him a front-row view of his brutality.
He watched this cousin shoot his wife.
After a petty argument at their apartment, Mike shot his wife in the face, killing her instantly.
And it stuck with him, not in the sense of it was a bad thing, not in the sense that how could you do something so horrendous? I mean, oh my God, being sick to your stomach. He was fascinated.
The fantasies of those that have committed serial crimes have been very carefully studied by the staff of the FBI Behavioral Science Unit over the years. The fantasies start very early in life and oftentimes are a result of some incident that triggers these thoughts. And once the fantasies become sexualized, it becomes extremely dangerous because they start fantasizing about events of rape, torture, mutilation.
I did not notice anything strange of him until we were in high school. And he was no longer part of my clique kind of thing. That's when I noticed that he was different and he had changed. Didn't no longer say hello, that kind of thing. I noticed that he would hang out with boys that did drugs.
A lot of second-generation immigrants sometimes get involved in gangs, and some of the thinking is that they see that their parents who've come to America and have worked really, really hard and have very little to show for it, and some people think that there's a disillusioning on their part, like why play by the rules if this is what you end up with, which is what my parents had. And I suppose you could say that that might have been a factor in the rebelliousness of Ricky Ramirez.
Ramirez became interested in hard rock and Satanism.
A lot of kids, high school kids for instance, were dabbling in this, and they would give it their own little touches. And being high school kids, the brain's still developing, they're developing. A lot of them got in trouble and went the wrong way. We did have some kids that killed their parents and things like that.
Ramirez dropped out of school and began living on the fringes of society, sometimes sleeping in the local cemetery.
Right from the get-go, Richard stole anything that was loose and anything that he could pry loose. I mean, his neighbors started calling him Didos Fingers, and they call him Ricky Rabone, Ricky the Thief.
After the attempted rape of a guest in an El Paso hotel, Ramirez moved to California.
He became a cocaine and alcohol addict. He lived in what's called Skid Row in Los Angeles, which is a pretty scruffy area. I mean, there are people doing everything and taking everything, and homelessness is not an unusual thing. You live in what's called a flop house, where you go and flop to get off your high or to recover. Now, did the drugs affect his brain functioning? Did it affect the way he saw the world? Probably, but it wasn't causative. It didn't lead to make him kill. He was already primed.
Ramirez lived day to day, taking drugs, using prostitutes, stealing cars, breaking and entering.
So he would go out in the suburbs where often they did not lock their doors at night even. They didn't lock their windows. This was like heaven for him. This is exactly what he was looking for. And he would go through the unlocked doors and unlocked windows. Sometimes he would go in and burglarize when nobody was home at night. And then he got bolder and bolder and bolder.
The vast majority of burglaries are for material gain. These are usually drug people who want to get some money to buy drugs, and they might do it with a friend or a partner and so on. But there are a small group of burglars that are sexually motivated, where the burglary itself is motivated by an urge to look, sexual stimulation through looking. And since about 50% of burglaries occur in the evening when the victim is likely to be home, it's very easy to see the progression from voyeurism to break-in entry to sexual assault or to sexual murder.
By May 1985, Richard Ramirez had killed at least 8 times, and his violent home invasions were about to escalate, plunging the people of Los Angeles into panic. In 1985, Los Angeles County was in the grip of a vicious serial killer. Ordinary citizens were no longer safe in their homes, as the mysterious killer, christened the Night Stalker, raped, murdered and mutilated in the name of Satan. The dreadful and indiscriminate crimes caused a wave of fear.
Everybody was scared. Everybody in the county of Los Angeles and Southern California was scared to death.
Gun sales seriously went up. Vast increase in gun sales. During the summer of '85, people were keeping their windows closed.
It was a very, very hot summer. I would not open the windows at night. We sweltered in our house every night because I was afraid somebody'd come in and kill me.
And still the violent attacks continued. In Burbank, on May the 30th, a 41-year-old woman was raped, while her 12-year-old son was locked, handcuffed in a closet. She was allowed to live. On the 27th of June, the body of a 28-year-old teacher was found in Arcadia. She'd been sodomized and her throat slit. On July the 2nd, again in Arcadia, a 75-year-old woman was found dead. She'd been beaten, her throat cut, and her home ransacked. Detective Gil Carrillo was convinced just one man was at work, but the facts flew in the face of received wisdom.
Here he was crossing all the gamuts, and the only consistency was his inconsistency in the way he was committing his crimes.
What the FBI was telling us is that serial killers tend to operate in the same way. They'll use the same weapon over and over, the same method of operation. But there were different weapons used. There were 2 separate guns that were used throughout these events. There were knives used on a couple of the occasions. There were bludgeons used on a couple of the occasions. These are all differences in the method of operation.
On July the 5th, the Night Stalker targeted a quiet suburban street in Sierra Madre. He entered the bedroom of 16-year-old schoolgirl Whitney Bennett.
You talk about a nightmare. Her parents awakened to her crying and coming down the hall. They find her in her bedroom on the floor, covered in blood. The suspect had entered the house, confronted her in bed while she was asleep, and beat her with a tire iron, and tried to strangle her and left her for dead. 4 feet of sutures ended up in her head, took to close the wound. As you work these cases or you're in law enforcement for a long period of time, you see a lot, and it has to have an effect on you. I know it takes its toll somewhere down the line. I've seen it.
The 7th of July was another in a long run of swelteringly hot nights.
I'm home alone. It's the first time that I've ever slept with my gun on the nightstand.
Everybody was afraid and pretty much kept their doors locked, windows locked, but the night was so hot and our summer was so hot, so here I had the doors open.
In the middle of the night, Detective Carrillo awoke, convinced the night stalker was in his own house.
I woke up, I was sweating, I was nauseated, and I got my gun and I cleared my house as if I was looking for a burglar. All of a sudden the phone rang, I scared the bejesus out of me, and it was my desk telling me to call my friend Linda.
In the early hours, crime scene investigator Linda Martinez had awoke with a start.
About 3 o'clock in the morning, my friend said, someone's calling your name, somebody's yelling for you.
Linda's neighbor was crying out for help.
I went to the back fence and called across the street to the lady calling me and asked her what was wrong. And she told me that she had been robbed and raped and she was handcuffed to her bed. Once I heard her voice, I knew it was him.
Sophie Dickman, a lady in her 60s, had been sexually assaulted. She was raped and...
Detective Carrillo recognized all the hallmarks of a night stalker attack.
I learned that he had verbalized words that were common that we had heard in the past, words he had spoke there. Where's the money, where's the jewelry? Shut up, bitch. There was no doubt in my mind we were dealing with the same guy.
His suspicions were confirmed by the discovery in a nearby home of the 61-year-old Joyce Nelson, beaten to death with a blunt object. The night stalker had struck twice in one night. And he would repeat the trick just 2 weeks later, on the 20th of July, first shooting Max and Layla Needing at their home in Glendale, before moving on to Sun Valley.
We had a couple that lived in a home. The male had been executed in his sleep. The woman had been sexually assaulted. And there was a young boy there that also had been assaulted.
Ramirez had again dispatched the husband as he slept. He had repeatedly beaten, sexually assaulted, and humiliated the mother, demanding that she pray to Satan for her life, and then raped her 8-year-old son.
It was not enough just to murder or to rape. He had to torture, and he loved to terrorize him. He would make them say, "Hail Satan."
Humiliation of victims is very, very typical in serial sexual homicide. This is arousing to them. This reassures the offender that they are in such complete control that they can degrade and humiliate the victim any way they want. Nothing could be more stimulating for an individual with this deviant sexual arousal pattern.
No one was able to predict or prevent the Night Stalker's crimes.
It's typical of serial killers to choose people who put themselves at risk somehow, like male or female prostitutes, like hitchhikers. But these other people, they were living their normal lives. They weren't doing anything at all that should have brought this down on them.
And the panic escalated.
The publicity of the killings was like a drum beat. The more killings, the more publicity, the more fear.
Hello, my name is Detective Gil Carrillo with the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department assigned to Homicide Bureau. And the Sheriff's Department is currently conducting an investigation into a series of homicides and sexual assaults that have occurred in Los Angeles County.
I knew how vicious and violent and how vile he really was, and there was an enormous amount of pressure to stop before he hurt anybody else, even more so before he hurt somebody in my own family.
People were buying guns, people were buying guard dogs, people were scared to death.
The suspect has used guns, knives, tire irons, as well as his own shod foot to inflict serious injury to several victims in the past.
Nobody knew who it was. Nobody knew where he was going to hit. People didn't know if they were going to live to see the next morning. It was really, really scary.
And then a shocking twist.
It was very obvious that our killer from Southern California had now struck in the city of San Francisco.
On the 17th of August, the Night Stalker had shot another couple in their home, leaving a satanic symbol on the wall. A week later, he struck 50 miles south of Los Angeles, shooting the husband and sexually assaulting the wife, forcing her to swear her love for Satan. With the killer on the move, detectives were now working night and day to try to catch him before he struck again.
Since the last taping, which was August 13, 1985, the suspect in this case, currently under investigation, has committed 2 more homicides.
I have the pressure of the world on me. I need to save not only my immediate family, my wife, my mother, and my kid, everybody, but the citizens of Los Angeles County. There's an animal going out there. I have to solve it.
The vehicle used in this crime was a 1976 Toyota station wagon. If the vehicle is found abandoned, contact Sergeant Frank Salerno or Detective Gil Carrillo.
My wife found my 13-year-old daughter crying in the bedroom. And she said, "What's wrong?" And she said nothing, and my wife said, "No, something's wrong. What is it?" And she said, "I just wish this were over." I just want my dad back.
Detective Carrillo didn't yet know it, but before the end of the month, he would be face to face with one of history's most heinous serial killers. By August of 1985, the Night Stalker had killed at least 13, terrorized Los Angeles County, and pushed investigators to their limits. Now he appeared to be on the move, and detectives feared he'd be even harder to catch.
Where we'd had him localized in Los Angeles County, now all of a sudden he's in the city of San Francisco. That was of great concern.
But by the end of the month, a number of important leads finally came together.
We actually, through informants that identified him, we knew where he hung out. We knew he liked drugs, and he used to hang around the Skid Row area.
At the same time, there was a fingerprint recovered on the rearview mirror of a stolen car that the killer had used. And they made Richard Ramirez off that fingerprint. The sheriff of LA County, the chief of police of LA City, the chief of Glendale decided that they were going to release the picture of the killer, Richard Ramirez, to the press immediately.
When they showed him, I told my husband, "Oh my God, look, that's Richie. That's Richie," but that was so weird because I can't comprehend him doing something like that, not with his personality.
We were in shock. I just knew what I knew of him as a child, and I was just shocked. I was just shocked.
On the morning of the 29th of August 1985, Richard Ramirez arrived in Los Angeles after visiting a brother in Arizona.
Ricky walked into the nearest convenience store to buy some candy, and he noticed people were looking at him. And then when he would look at them, they'd look away, of course. And as he was waiting for his change, he looked at the newspapers on the counter. And every paper, there were 4 or 5 of them then from LA and from the area, every paper had his picture, his photograph. And then one woman, she said, it's him, El Matador, which is killer in Spanish.
Ramirez panicked and fled.
So he started running through yards, crossed over fences. He climbed about a 9-foot sound barrier wall. As he went through yards, people were calling in. They were calling to the Los Angeles Police Department, saying somebody's coming to my yard, I have a prowler. Members of the Los Angeles Police Department were already on his trail. They were following the 911 calls. Continued running east in a northeasterly direction and made it all the way to Hubbard Street. He tries to carjack a female resident. She screams.
We were actually still asleep. We heard a bang, then a scream. We ran out here. We noticed a tall, dark, skinny guy running, and my dad right behind him. We just came running as fast as we can to assist my dad and the neighbors.
Richard has been running for about 2 miles.
Pretty much caught up to him about here and tackled him right here up against this fence.
Citizens come out and surround him.
And he was right here, just sitting down right here. He was bleeding because one of the neighbors had hit him with a fence post right over the head. He was perspiring and huffing and puffing and looked very tired and scary. He looked very scary, actually.
People just started coming out with the newspapers and saying that's the killer, the matón, that's, you know, a Night Stalker.
With Ramirez in custody, officers would now come face to face with the killer for the first time.
When I saw him, he just had this evil look in his eye. He just looked so sinister, as if he were possessed. He just looked evil.
I remember playing with his anxiety level, trying to make it go up and come down. I wanted to see what I could do to raise it or lower it. And Richard was almost to the point of hyperventilation. His head was down on the table and he's going, and for a millisecond, just for a millisecond, I'm becoming somewhat nervous. I knew that this guy was into Satanism, and all of a sudden when he starts hyperventilating, I'm saying to myself, if this guy starts levitating, I'm out of here.
This is a guy that, although at times there were photographs taken of him that he looked like, wild man, he's not somebody would point out and say, there goes that crazy SOB, because he just doesn't come across that way.
He was much more intelligent than I envisioned. People think of him as a crazed man. I didn't think he was crazy. He was much more articulate than most murder suspects that I've interviewed.
Ramirez revealed he was well schooled in murder.
The impression I got from him was that he was well read, even though he had dropped out of school, I think after the 9th grade or so, thereabouts. He was very interested in murder and killing and past serial killers, because he'd done a lot of reading on that.
He could tell you everything about serial killers from the time the Romans fed the Christians to the lions to modern-day serial killers. When we took him to his first cell, and he found out that that was the cell that Angelo Bono, who was part of the Hillside Strangler duo, that's the cell he was in, he was excited.
The Night Stalker had petrified California and haunted detectives Salerno and Carrillo for 5 months. Now he was finally behind bars.
I remember seeing my mother and a couple of my sisters, and they came up and I started crying. It was over. I said, it's okay. It's over.
In 1989, Richard Ramirez was found guilty of 13 murders and 30 attempted murders, rapes, and sexual assaults. He was sentenced to death. So what drove the Night Stalker to his ultimate destiny as one of history's most savage serial murderers? Were the lessons he learnt in his upbringing to blame? Or was Richard Ramirez born to kill?
I don't see anything in his upbringing that was any more unusual than a lot of people. I know a lot of successful people have gone through hell being raised and come out just fine. This could be a case, and it probably is a case of when he was conceived, he's a bad seed. No matter how he was raised, he was destined to do what he did.
A lot of people grow up poor, and a lot of people are abused in their childhood, but they don't all grow up to do the things that Richard Ramirez did.
It does not appear that he was abused as a child or deprived, or there is certainly no evidence that that was presented. So how did he grow up to do these things?
The best way to look at it is from a biopsychosocial approach, but with a heavy emphasis on neurobiology, whether it's hormonal, chemical, electrical, brain damage, some combination of facts, plus psychosocial stressors, abuse never helps. Many, many things have to go wrong in order for one of these individuals to be created.
Richard Ramirez was born to kill. He began his life in the way everybody does, seemingly normal. Something happened in that gene that he has, something that was added on to by the experiences that he had in his environment in childhood. It's like a recipe. You have a basic thing, you add to that recipe, you add to that recipe, and finally you have the born killer.
Natured or nurtured? I don't believe anybody is born with this in them. You know, this comes about from something they've learned, they've seen, and they've decided to do. Richard had the liberties to do whatever he wanted to do and was a drifter early on in age. And when you couple that with narcotics activity, the drugs, you know, then that definitely causes problems in the mind, and I don't think anybody's born like that. They learn, they see, and they do.
The new series of Born to Kill continues next Sunday at the same time with the notorious Green River killer Gary Ridgway. And to find out more about serial killers, check out our crime files online at crimeandinvestigation.co.uk/serial killers.